The war was over, but peace was a curse. Across the sun-scorched plains and rocky isles of Greece, a generation of men knew nothing but the spear and the shield. For nearly 30 years, the Peloponnesian War had been their father, their teacher, their god. It had pitted city against city, brother against brother. It had bled the coffers of Athens dry and crowned Sparta with a bitter, precarious victory. Now, in the first years of the 4th century BC, an uneasy quiet had settled over the land, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. For thousands of men, this silence was starvation. They were the masters of a brutal craft in a world that suddenly claimed to have no need of it. They were hoplites, the heavy infantry that had dominated the battlefields of the age. Their bodies were maps of scars, their minds honed by years of terror and discipline in the phalanx. They knew the sickening crunch of a spear finding its mark, the rhythmic tramp of sandals on a dusty road, the metallic taste of fear before the first charge. They had survived the plague in Athens, the disastrous Sicilian expedition, the final, crushing naval defeat at They were the survivors of a meat grinder that had consumed their friends, their youth, and their homes. And now, they were obsolete. They drifted through the marketplaces of their cities like ghosts, their hands, calloused from gripping a 2.5-meter spear, now empty. The fields they had left behind were fallow or had been seized by opportunistic aristocrats. The trades they once knew were forgotten. The only skill they had perfected, the art of killing, was no longer in demand. Sparta, the new hegemon of Greece, had no use for the thousands of unemployed soldiers, many of them from defeated Athens and her former allies, who now roamed the countryside. These men were a problem, a dangerous, combustible element in a fragile new order. They were hungry, they were proud, and they were armed. In the smoky taverns of Piraeus and the dusty agora of Corinth, whispers began to circulate. The whispers came from the east, carried on the lips of recruiters with foreign accents and heavy purses. They spoke of a land of legendary wealth, a land of endless sun and opportunity. Persia, the great king's empire, the colossal power that had tried and failed to conquer Greece a century ago, was now a place not of existential threat, but of employment. The whispers spoke of a name, Cyrus. He was called Cyrus the Younger, to distinguish him from the founder of the Persian Empire. He was the second son of the late King Darius II, a prince of immense charisma and even greater ambition. He was the satrap, the governor of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, ruling a vast and wealthy portion of Anatolia, the western edge of the Persian domain. Unlike most Persian nobles, who viewed the Greeks with a mixture of contempt and fear, Cyrus admired them. He had seen their tenacity, their discipline, their unmatched prowess in battle. During the final years of the Peloponnesian War, he had allied with Sparta, his gold financing the fleet that ultimately starved Athens into submission. He knew what Greek soldiers could do, and he wanted to hire them, all of them. The offer was almost too good to be true. The recruiters promised a handsome wage, 1 daric a month, a golden coin stamped with the image of a Persian king, worth more than a month's pay for a skilled laborer back home. It was a fortune. It was enough to feed a family for months, to buy a small plot of land, to start over. And this was just the basic pay. There were promises of bonuses, of plunder, of rewards beyond the wildest dreams of a common soldier. The mission, they were told, was simple. Cyrus needed to discipline the Pisidians, a collection of unruly mountain tribes in southern Anatolia who habitually raided the lowlands and defied Persian authority. It was a routine military operation, a show of force to restore order. It required the best, and Cyrus was willing to pay for them. It was a perfect story, plausible, straightforward, and lucrative. For men with nothing left to lose, it was a siren song. From every corner of the Hellenic world, they came. There were Arcadians from the rugged central Peloponnese, men born in the mountains, tough as weathered oak. There were Achaeans, Thebans, and Thessalians. Most numerous and most desperate were the Athenians and their former subjects, men who had lost everything in the war and now saw a Persian prince as their only savior. They sold what little they had, polished their bronze cuirasses, sharpened their iron-tipped spears, and said their farewells. They gathered at Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, a city of staggering wealth and oriental splendor that sat at the western terminus of the royal road. Here, the Greeks saw the true scale of Cyrus's power. The city teemed with his preparations. Gold flowed from the treasury like water. The prince himself was a magnetic figure, young, handsome, athletic, and possessed of a regal confidence that was both inspiring and unsettling. He moved with a purpose that seemed to exceed the stated goal of punishing a few mountain tribes. He reviewed the assembling Greek force, his eyes lingering on their disciplined ranks, their gleaming shields, their hardened faces. He saw not just mercenaries, he saw a key, a weapon that could unlock an empire. Among the Greeks, a loose command structure formed. The most prominent leader was Cunaxa, a Spartan general in exile. He was the archetypal Spartan, stern, laconic, a brilliant tactician and a harsh disciplinarian who had been sentenced to death in his homeland for disobeying orders. He was a man who understood only war, and in Cyrus he found a patron who could provide it. Other commanders joined him: Proxenus the Boeotian, a student of the famed sophist Gorgias, Menon the Thessalian, a treacherous and greedy youth, and a dozen others, each bringing their own contingent of followers. And then there was Xenophon, an Athenian of noble birth. He was not a soldier, not truly. He was a gentleman adventurer, a former student of Socrates, drawn to the expedition by his friend Proxenus. He came not for the pay, but for the experience, for the thrill of seeing the exotic East under the wing of a powerful prince. He was an observer, a passenger on a great adventure, little knowing that fate would soon thrust him into the very center of the storm. As the army swelled to over 10,000 hoplites, supported by Cyrus's own force of Asiatic troops, a sense of unease began to creep beneath the excitement. The sheer size of the force felt like overkill for a minor campaign against mountain bandits. The logistics, the expense, the sheer ambition radiating from Cyrus, it all pointed to something more, something far grander and more dangerous. But the gold was good, and the promise of glory was intoxicating. For now, the men kept their doubts to themselves. They took Cyrus's gold, they accepted his authority, and they prepared to march. They stood on the edge of Asia, a formidable army of exiles and survivors, forged in the crucible of one war, and now selling their spears in another. They believed they were marching to a quick, profitable campaign. In the mountains of Pisidia, they were wrong. They were marching into the heart of an empire, towards a battle for the throne of the world. They were marching towards their own destruction, and a struggle for survival that would become legend. The lure of gold and glory had been set, and the trap was about to spring. To understand the storm that was about to break over the 10,000. One had to first understand the man who had summoned it. He was not merely a paymaster or a provincial governor. He was a product of the Achaemenid court, a world of absolute power, suffocating protocol, and lethal intrigue. He was Cyrus, and he was a man who believed he had been cheated by the gods. His ambition was forged in the shadow of the throne. He was the second son of King Darius II and his formidable queen Paracetis, while his elder brother Arcases was born before their father became king. Cyrus was born in the Purple Bourne after Darius had ascended to the throne of Persia. In his own mind, and perhaps whispered into his ear by his fiercely supportive mother, this fact made all the difference. It gave him a superior claim, a legitimacy that his placid, conventional older brother lacked. He was the son of a king. Arcases was merely the son of Darius. It was a subtle distinction, but in the venomous atmosphere of the Persian court, such subtleties were the seeds from which rebellions grew. From his youth, Cyrus was everything his brother was not. Where Arcases was cautious and traditional, Cyrus was daring, innovative, and dangerously charismatic. He possessed a restless energy, a burning desire not just to rule, in the passive administrative way of his brother, but to conquer, to achieve, to leave a mark on the world, as indelible as that of his namesake, Cyrus the Great. He was a superb horseman, a deadly hunter, and a student of war. He cultivated an image of himself as a man who was both a quintessential Persian aristocrat and something Mara, leader who could bridge the worlds of East and West. His appointment as satrap of the western provinces was his proving ground. While most Persian nobles would have treated the posting as an opportunity to enrich themselves through corruption and indolence, Cyrus used it as a laboratory for his ambitions. He established a court at Sardis that rivaled the splendor of those in Babylon or Susa. But it was a court with a purpose. He studied the Greeks, the strange, fractious people on the western fringe of his territory. Other Persians saw them as barbarians, insolent, untrustworthy, and chaotic. Cyrus saw them as the most effective fighting force on the planet. He saw their discipline, their heavy armor, their unwavering courage in the face of death. and he recognized it as a tool of immense power. His support for Sparta in the Peloponnesian War was a masterstroke of political calculation. It was not born of any love for the Spartans, but from a cold, clear-eyed assessment of his needs. By financing their fleet, he helped them crush Athens, the other great Greek military power. In doing so, he not only weakened a potential future enemy, but also placed the victors in his debt. More importantly, the war's end unleashed a flood of unemployed, battle-hardened Greek soldiers onto the market. He had engineered his own supply of the perfect weapon. His personality was a carefully constructed edifice of charm and intimidation. To his friends and allies, he was impossibly generous. He believed that a ruler's wealth was measured not by what he kept, but by what he gave away. He showered his supporters with gifts of land, horses, and gold, binding them to him with chains. Of gratitude, he made a great show of justice, punishing criminals and corrupt officials with a theatrical severity that both terrified and reassured his subjects. He cultivated loyalty with the precision of a master gardener. But beneath the charm lay a core of pure, unyielding steel. His pride was absolute. He could not bear insult or failure. When he felt he had been wronged, his anger was swift and terrible. He was a man who saw the world as a simple equation. There were those who were with him, and there were those who stood in his way. The latter, he believed, deserved only to be crushed. The ultimate object of this towering ambition was his brother. When their father, Darius II, lay on his deathbed in 404 BC, Cyrus was summoned to Babylon. He went, perhaps believing his mother, Parasatis, could still persuade the dying king to name him as successor. Instead, he was forced to watch as Artaxerxes was crowned King Artaxerxes II. The throne, he felt, was his. By right was now occupied by a man he considered his inferior in every way. The humiliation was immediate and profound. Shortly after the coronation, Tissaphernes, a rival satrap, and a man who despised Cyrus's growing power, accused him of plotting to assassinate the new king during the ceremony. The charge was almost certainly true. Artaxerxes, in a moment of kingly authority, ordered his brother's execution. Cyrus was seized, and his life hung by a thread. It was only the desperate, frantic pleading of their mother Parasatis, who threw herself at Artaxerxes' feet, that saved him. The king relented, sparing Cyrus's life and, in an act of astonishing naivety, sending him back to his satrapy in Sardis. It was a mistake that would cost the empire dearly. Artaxerxes may have forgiven his brother, but Cyrus did not forgive him. The public disgrace, the near execution, the confirmation of his brother on the throne, all coalesced into a single, burning obsession: revenge. From the moment he returned to Sardis, every action, every decision, every gold Derek spent, was directed toward one goal. He would not just reclaim what he believed was his, he would eradicate the man who had shamed him. He began his preparations, in secret, using the excuse of personal security and regional instability to build his forces. He picked quarrels with Tissaphernes, using the conflict as a pretext to raise armies to defend his territory. He quietly funneled money to his recruiters. In Greece, assembling the great mercenary army under the plausible cover story of a campaign against the Pisidians. He was patient, meticulous, and utterly ruthless. As he stood before the 10,000 Greeks in the fields outside Sardis, they saw a charismatic prince offering them gold. They could not see the depths of the fraternal hatred that fueled him. They could not see that they were not simply soldiers for hire. They were the sharpened edge of his vengeance. They were the instrument he had forged to carve his brother's heart out of the Persian Empire. His ambition was a fire that had been stoked for a lifetime, and he was now ready to let it burn down the world to get what he wanted. The Greeks were merely the kindling. Sardis became the center of a vortex, pulling in the desperate and the deadly from all corners of the Hellenic world. The city itself was a shock to the senses for the newly arrived Greeks. 4 men accustomed to the austere, functional cities of their homeland, to the whitewashed stone of Athens, or the barracks-like severity of Sparta. Sardis was a vision from another world. It was a city built on wealth and conquest, the ancient capital of the Lydian kings like Croesus, whose name was synonymous with unimaginable riches. Now, as the western seat of Persian power, its opulence had only deepened. The air hung thick, with the scent of exotic spices, roasting meats, and the dust of the Anatolian plain. The streets were a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of peoples, Lydians in their distinctive robes, Phrygians, Carians, haughty Persian nobles on horseback attended, by retinues of servants, and everywhere, the growing conspicuous presence of the Greeks. They stood out, these mercenaries, with their sun-darkened skin, their clipped, laconic speech, and the quiet, dangerous confidence of men whose trade was violence. They walked through the sprawling bazaars, their eyes taking in the piles of rich carpets, the gleaming metalwork, the merchants hawking goods from the far reaches of the empire. But mostly, their eyes were on each other. They were a gathering storm of bronze and muscle. They set up their camps in the fields outside the city walls, on the plains watered by the Pactolus River, the very river that was said to have once flowed with gold. The camp was a city in itself, a sprawling, temporary metropolis of leather tents and flickering campfires. It was a testament to the fractured state of Greece. Here, an Athenian hoplite, whose father might have died fighting Spartans, now found himself bedding down next to a Spartan exile. A Theban shared his wine with an Arcadian. Old enmities, the bitter legacies of the Peloponnesian War, were not forgotten, but they were suppressed, subordinated to the promise of Cyrus's gold. The derrick, stamped with the great king's image, was a more powerful unifier than any treaty or shared heritage. Discipline, in these early days, was a challenge. These were not the citizen soldiers of a single polis, bound by civic duty and shared laws. They were individuals, each with his own pride and his own price. Fights broke out, fueled by cheap wine and old grudges. Yet, an order began to emerge, imposed by the commanders who had recruited them. Chief among these was Clearchus, the Spartan. He was a man who seemed to be carved from granite, his face a mask of grim authority. He was in his 50s, a veteran of countless campaigns, and he radiated an aura of absolute, uncompromising command. His own contingent of Peloponnesian troops was the most disciplined in the army, a corps of professionals around which the others slowly coalesced. Clearchus was not a man to be loved, but he was a man to be followed, especially into a fight. He understood the brutal calculus of war, and the men, in turn, understood that his harshness was a form of protection. He would drill them until they dropped, punish insubordination with a flogging or worse. But on the battlefield, his judgment might be the difference between life and death. Other commanders held their own sway. There was Proxenus of Boeotia, a man of wealth and education, a student of the great orator Gorgias. He believed leadership was won through kindness and praise, and his men were loyal to him personally. Though veterans like Clearchus viewed his methods with contempt, there was Menon of Thessaly, young, handsome, and consumed by a naked, rapacious greed. He commanded a rough contingent of men from northern Greece, and it was an open secret that he was as treacherous as he was ambitious, loyal only to the highest bidder. And there were others: Socrates, the Achaean, Aegeus, the Arcadian, a dozen more captains and generals, each the leader of his own tribe of followers. The army was a mosaic of Greek military traditions. The Spartan and Arcadian hoplites formed the solid, dependable heart of the infantry, men who knew the discipline of the phalanx as intimately as they knew their own names. The Cretans arrived with their powerful bows, their reputation as the finest archers in the known world preceding them. There were Rhodian slingers, whose lead bullets were said to be more accurate and deadly than arrows, capable of punching through armor. Day after day, Cyrus would ride out from the city to review his growing force. He was a magnificent sight. On his white charger, surrounded by his personal guard of Persian cavalry, he would watch the Greeks drill, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw the way they formed their shield wall, a seamless barrier of bronze and wood. He heard the thunderous crash as they practiced the athismos, the massed shove of shields that decided battles. He noted their efficiency, their lack of wasted movement, their sheer, brutal professionalism. This was what his gold had bought. This was the machine he would unleash upon his brother. Among this sea of hardened soldiers, Xenophon of Athens moved as an anomaly. He carried no command, sought no recruits. He was a guest of Proxenus, his friend, who had invited him, along with the promise of adventure and the chance to endear himself to the great Prince Cyrus. Xenophon was a scholar and a horseman, a man of ideas, a disciple of the philosopher Socrates. He was more comfortable in a symposium debating the nature of virtue than in a military camp. Yet, he was fascinated by what he saw. He watched the grizzled veterans, listened to their stories, and studied the complex web of loyalties and rivalries that held the army together. He was an outsider, a chronicler in waiting, observing the assembly of the pieces of a game whose rules he did not yet understand. As the weeks passed, the army took its final shape. It numbered around 13,000 men. Of these, roughly 10,600 were Greek hoplites. The rest comprised a smaller force of Greek light infantry, the peltasts, archers, and slingers, and Cyrus's own army of about 100,000 Asiatic troops. Though these were of vastly inferior quality to the Hellenes, the Greeks were the tip of the spear, the decisive element. Finally, the order came. The preparations were complete. The time for waiting was over. The recruiter's promises, the lure of gold, the charisma of the princet had all led to this moment. The great army, this gathering storm of ambition and desperation, was to march. Their stated destination was the mountains of Pisidia, a few hundred kilometers to the southeast. But as the men shouldered their heavy ashwood spears and raised their shields, a sense of profound and irreversible momentum took hold. They were leaving the familiar shores of the Aegean behind, plunging into the vast, unknown continent of Asia. They were no longer just a collection of individuals. They were an army, a single entity with a terrible purpose. They just didn't know what it was yet. The first day of the march was filled with a rough, boisterous optimism. The long, snaking column of men and baggage animals kicked up a cloud of dust that was visible for miles. A man-made haze, moving slowly but inexorably eastward. For the Greek soldiers, this was the familiar rhythm of a campaign's beginning. The weight of the aspis, the heavy bronze-faced shield on the left shoulder was a familiar burden. The rhythmic tramp of thousands of sandals on the hard-packed earth was a familiar song. The banter and crude jokes that passed between the files were a familiar comfort, a way to ward off the vastness of the Anatolian landscape that was now unfolding around them. Cyrus led them out of Sardis, riding at the head of his magnificent Persian cavalry, his standards fluttering in the dry breeze. The army moved with a surprising efficiency for its size. The Greek contingents marched in their own units, under their own commanders, but they were part of a larger, well-organized whole. Scouts ranged ahead, supply wagons rumbled in the center, and a rearguard kept a watchful eye. It all felt professional, well-funded, and purposeful. Their route took them through the ancient lands of Lydia and Phrygia, territories firmly under Cyrus's control. The cities they passed, Colossae, Salonai, Pelte, were obligated to provide markets for the troops. In these cities, the scale of Cyrus's wealth was once again put on full display. Provisions were plentiful. Wine flowed freely. More importantly, pay was delivered on time. Cyrus understood the mercenary mindset perfectly. A soldier's loyalty was directly proportional to the weight of his purse and the fullness of his belly. As long as the gold darricks kept coming, the men were content to march. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the sun beat down with the relentless baking heat, a subtle current of unease began to flow through the ranks. It was a soldier's intuition, a feeling born of experience. They had been told they were marching to Pisidia to fight troublesome mountain tribes, but their route was not taking them directly south, into the rugged Taurus mountains where the Pisidians lived. Instead, they continued ever eastward, following the great trunk roads that led deeper and deeper into the continent. The questions started as murmurs around the campfires at night. If we are fighting mountain men, why are we marching across these endless plains? An Athenian might ask a grizzled Arcadian veteran. The veteran, spitting on the ground, might reply, "The pay is good, keep marching." But the thought, once planted, began to grow. Every sunrise brought them further from the sea, further from anything that felt like home, and no closer to their supposed enemy. The landscape itself became a source of psychological pressure. It was vast, open, and alien. The rolling hills gave way to immense flat plains that stretched to a shimmering horizon. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the dust was a constant torment, coating their skin, their clothes, their food. It was a world away from the intimate, sea-defined geography of Greece. Here, a man could feel terribly small, a tiny speck in an endless, indifferent expanse. The commanders, particularly the sharp-witted Clearchus, were not blind. They saw the same maps Cyrus did. They knew this was not the road to Pisidia. Clearchus, a man who trusted no one, least of all a Persian prince, began to suspect the truth. He was too shrewd a strategist not to recognize the signs of a major military operation aimed at a far more significant target. An expedition against mountain bandits did not require 10,000 of the best heavy infantry in the world. It did not require this relentless, arrow-straight march toward the heart of the empire. He confronted Cyrus, The details of their meeting are lost to history, but it was likely a tense affair. Clearchus, with his blunt Spartan demeanor, would have demanded answers. Cyrus, with his practiced princely charm, would have deflected and reassured. He was a master of manipulation. He likely invented a new pretext, perhaps claiming that his real enemy was a rival satrap, Anabasis, who was said to be waiting with an army on the Euphrates River. He would have framed it as a personal quarrel, a matter of honor, and sweetened the pot with promises of more money, of easy plunder from a rich and cowardly foe. He was lying, of course. It was a new layer of deception, designed to placate the increasingly suspicious Greeks and keep them marching just a little further, and it worked, for a time. The mention of a rival army and the promise of a real battle was enough to satisfy the more warlike elements of the force. The promise of more gold was enough for the rest. Clearchus, though likely unconvinced, had little choice. He had led his men this far. Turning back now was impossible. He was bound to Cyrus and to the fate of the army. The deception was a heavy blanket smothering the truth, but holes were beginning to appear. The soldiers could feel it. They saw the deference paid to Cyrus by the local populations, a deference reserved not for a mere satrap, but for someone aspiring to be much more. They saw the vast stockpiles of supplies being laid in for them, logistics on a scale that spoke of a royal ambition. They were not fools. They were veterans who understood the anatomy of war, and this campaign felt different. It felt too big, too important. They marched on, through the great city of Iconium and into the lands of Lycaonia. They were now hundreds of miles from the Aegean coast, a journey of many weeks. The name Pisidia was a distant, fading memory, a joke whispered in the ranks. The great deception held, but only just. The men kept marching, drawn forward by the promise of gold and the sheer momentum of the expedition. But they marched now, with a growing sense of dread, a feeling that they were not masters of their own fate, but merely pieces in a vast and deadly game whose purpose was being deliberately hidden from them. They were walking into a trap, and the man who paid them was the one setting it. The Euphrates River was more than a body of water. It was a boundary. To the west lay the familiar, if vast, lands of Anatolia. To the east lay Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the heartland of the Persian Empire. To cross it was to leave the world you knew behind and enter the domain of the great king himself. For the Greek army, its muddy, swirling waters represented the final, undeniable line between suspicion and certainty. There could be no more lies. Here they arrived at Thapsacus, a major crossing point on the great river. The city was a hub of trade and travel, the last significant outpost before the plunge into the deserts that led to Babylon. The air was thick with the humidity of the river and the tension of 1,000 unspoken questions. The name Pisidia had long since become a bitter joke among the ranks. The pretense of chasing a rival satrap, Anabasis, had also worn thin, as scouts reported no sign of any such army in the vicinity. Here, at the river's edge, the deception had reached its geographic and psychological limit. The men stopped. It was not an organized mutiny, not yet, but a spontaneous, collective refusal. The marching columns dissolved into agitated groups of soldiers. They clustered around their commanders, their faces dark with anger and betrayal. They had marched for 3 months, covering nearly 1,000 miles, on the basis of a lie. Now, they looked at the wide, brown expanse of the Euphrates, and they understood. On the other side of that river lay Babylon. On the other side of that river lay Artaxerxes. This was not a punitive expedition. This was a rebellion. This was a civil war for the throne of Persia, and they, the 10,000 Greeks, were the tip of the rebels' spear. They had been tricked into becoming king-killers, pawns in a fraternal power struggle a world away from their homes. Their anger was palpable. They felt like fools, their professionalism and trust exploited by a charming, duplicitous prince. They refused to cross. The army, the great weapon Cyrus had so carefully assembled, ground to a halt. Paralyzed by the truth, Clearchus, the grim Spartan, found himself in an impossible position. He was caught between the fury of his men and the unyielding ambition of his paymaster. The soldiers looked to him, their most respected general, to voice their outrage. They expected him to stand with them against the Persian. Clearchus knew he had to act, to control the narrative before it exploded into open violence. He called his own men to an assembly. His face was a mask of stone, but his words were carefully chosen. He feigned his own anger, his own sense of betrayal. He spoke of his loyalty not to Cyrus, but to them, his soldiers. "I am a Greek, like you," he might have said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Your fate is my fate. If you wish to turn back, I will turn back with you." But then he laid out the brutal reality of their situation. "But consider this," he would have continued, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "We are 1,000 miles from home. We have no guides, no provisions. If we break with Cyrus now, we make an enemy of him. He will harass our retreat every step of the way. The satraps of these lands are loyal to him. The local tribes will see us as prey. To turn back now, alone, is to choose a slow, starving death in a hostile land. But if we stay with him, he needs us. He will continue to pay us, to feed us. He is our best, our only hope of survival." It was a cold, merciless piece of logic, and it struck home. He had transformed the question from one of honor and betrayal to one of pure, stark survival. He had given them the illusion of choice while pointing to the only viable path. With the Greeks wavering, their anger now tempered by fear, Cyrus seized his moment. He summoned all the commanders and then addressed the entire army. He dropped the charade. There was no more talk of pursuit or rival satraps. He stood before them and laid his ambition bare. His voice, rich with practiced charisma, rolled over the assembled thousands. He spoke of his birthright, of being born in the purple while his brother was not. He spoke of the incompetence of Artaxerxes, a weak king controlled by sycophants, a ruler under whom the empire was decaying. He painted a picture of his own reign, one of strength, justice, and generosity. And then he came to the point. "I am marching to Babylon," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I am marching to claim the throne that is rightfully mine. I need you with me. You are the finest soldiers in the world. With you by my side, victory is certain." A murmur went through the army. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to hear it stated so plainly. Then came the Cyrus knew that for these men, ambition and honor were fine things, but gold was the ultimate motivator. He made them an offer that was staggering, an amount of money that defied belief. He promised to raise their pay from 1 derrick a month to 1.5. And when they reached Babylon, when the throne was his, he would give every single soldier a bonus of 5 silver minas, enough money to make a man rich for life, to return to Greece and live as a man of substance and property. For the commanders, the rewards would be even greater. A profound silence fell over the army. The men looked at each other, their minds racing. They weighed the betrayal against the promised fortune. They weighed the terror of marching on the great king against the terror of trying to retreat alone. They looked at Cyrus, this prince who had lied to them, but was now offering them a kingdom's ransom. They were mercenaries. This was the ultimate contract. Slowly, a consensus formed, not in words, but in the shifting mood of the crowd. The anger had been replaced by a new, more dangerous emotion, greed. They were already here. The boats to cross the Euphrates were waiting. The path back was a phantom, a ghost of a choice. The path forward led to either death or unimaginable wealth. For men who had nothing, it was a gamble worth taking. One by one, the contingents agreed. The commanders, seeing the direction, the wind was blowing, and thinking of their own massive bonuses, urged their men on. The army would cross. The die was cast. As the first Greek soldiers stepped onto the boats and pushed off into the current of the Euphrates, they were leaving more than just the western bank behind. They were leaving behind their status as neutral contractors. They were now officially rebels, traitors against the Persian crown. There was no turning back. Every man in the army, from Cyrus the General to the youngest hoplite, was now marked for death by the King of Kings. Their only hope for survival was to see Cyrus seated on the throne in Babylon. They had crossed their Rubicon, asterisk, having crossed the Euphrates, the army stepped into another world. The last vestiges of the familiar Anatolian landscape, with its rolling hills and scattered woodlands, vanished behind them. Before them lay the deserts of northern Mesopotamia, a landscape that felt primeval and utterly hostile to human life. This was the true beginning of the ordeal, the first taste of the hell they had chosen. The world was bleached of color, reduced to a palette of browns and blistering hazy whites. The ground was a featureless plain of sand and gravel, stretching to a horizon that shimmered and danced with heat. The sun was no longer just a source of light and warmth. It was a malevolent entity, a physical weight that pressed down on them from a cloudless, metallic sky. It beat upon their bronze helmets until they were too hot to touch, turning them into small ovens that cooked the men inside. Soldiers began wrapping their heads in strips of cloth beneath their helmets, a desperate, inadequate defense against the relentless solar assault. The march began before dawn each day, in the cool, deceptive grayness of the pre-light, but within hours, the furnace was lit. The heat became a physical presence, sucking the moisture from their bodies, cracking their lips, and filling their lungs with air that felt like it had come from a blacksmith's forge. The dust, fine as flour, was a constant companion. It was kicked up by the tramp of 26,000 feet and the hooves of thousands of horses and baggage animals, creating a perpetual, choking cloud that hung over the column. It worked its way into everything: their eyes, their mouths, their food, the mechanisms of their equipment. A man's sweat would turn to a gritty paste on his skin. Water became the sole object of their devotion, the only currency that truly mattered. The canteens they carried were pitifully small, the water within quickly becoming warm and unrefreshing. The days were measured not in miles, but in the agonizingly long stretches between wells or the muddy, brackish pools they occasionally found. When they did find water, discipline would fray at the edges as men, mad with thirst, shoved and fought. To be the first to drink, the commanders had to post guards at the wells to maintain order, to ensure the precious liquid was rationed. For the Greeks, this was a unique form of torture. Their entire way of war was predicated on heavy armor and disciplined close order formations. The phalanx was a creature of the temperate, firm grounds of Greece. Here, it was a self-inflicted punishment. The hoplites panoplied the helmet, the bronze cuirass, the greaves weighed upwards of 50 pounds. In the heat, this armor became a cage of misery. The metal burned their skin, and the weight drove them into the sandy earth, making every step a monumental effort. Yet, to abandon the armor was to invite death from the unseen enemies that surely watched them from the shimmering haze. The landscape was not entirely empty. It was populated by ghosts and mirages. Herds of wild asses, incredibly swift, would appear in the distance and vanish like smoke. Ostriches, strange and gangly creatures, would race the cavalry, their long legs devouring the desert terrain. The soldiers, desperate for fresh meat and a diversion from the monotony, would give chase. It was always a futile effort. The desert animals were masters of their environment, and the Greeks were clumsy, dying intruders. These failed hunts only served to deepen their exhaustion and waste the precious energy of their horses. Starvation began to creep into the camp. The supplies Cyrus had stockpiled were dwindling faster than anticipated. The land offered nothing. There were no farms to plunder, no villages to trade with. The grain they carried had to be ground by hand into coarse flour, a laborious soul task at the end of a day's march. When the grain ran out for the baggage animals, the horses, mules, and oxen, they began to weaken and die, their carcasses left to rot under the unforgiving sun. The soldiers watched the animals perish and saw a grim foreshadowing of their own fate. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. The endless, featureless plain was a disorienting nightmare. There were no landmarks, no sense of progress. Every day looked exactly like the one before. A profound sense of isolation set in. They were a tiny, crawling island of humanity in a dead sea of sand. The camaraderie of the camp, once boisterous and defiant, grew quieter, more brittle. Men became withdrawn, hoarding their energy. Their thoughts turned inward to dreams of cool streams, green fields, and the homes they now believed they would never see again. This was the price of their gamble. The fantastic wealth promised in Babylon seemed like a fever dream, a cruel joke in this wasteland. They had traded their honor for gold, and now the gods were exacting payment in heat, thirst, and despair. Cyrus rode among them, still projecting an aura of confidence, but even he could not conjure water from sand or shade from the naked sky. This march was a deliberate strategy. Cyrus was taking the most direct route to Babylon, a path that avoided the major fortified cities along the river. It was a calculated risk, trading the certainty of facing well-garrisoned cities for the grueling trial of the desert. He was gambling that his army could endure the unendurable, that their physical and mental fortitude would hold long enough to reach the battlefield. For the 10,000 it was a forging. The heat, the thirst, and the hunger burned away every non-essential part of them. It stripped them of their bravado, their pride, their individuality. What was left was the hard, disciplined core of the professional soldier. They learned to endure, to place one foot in front of the other, to survive. They were being hammered into a weapon, tempered in the furnace of the desert. They were marching into the inferno, and it was reshaping them into something harder and more dangerous than they had ever been before. After 17 agonizing days in the desert inferno, the landscape began to change. The first hints of green appeared on the horizon, scrubby vegetation at first. Then the unmistakable, life-giving dark green of cultivated land. They had reached the Fertile Crescent, the verdant lands fed by the intricate canal systems that webbed the terrain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They had survived the desert, but they had not reached an oasis. They had reached the killing ground. The army had arrived at the province of Babylonia, the heartland of the king. The air itself felt different here. It was thick with humidity, but also with an unspoken, imminent threat. The soldiers could feel the eyes on them. Every village they passed was deserted, the inhabitants having fled before their approach. It was an eerie, unnatural silence. This was enemy territory in its purest form. They were no longer marching through the wild, but through the very seat of Artaxerxes' power. Scouts began to bring back increasingly alarming reports. They found tracks not of a few horsemen, but of a vast host. A deep, wide trench had been dug across their path, a massive defensive earthwork stretching for miles. But strangely, the trench was undefended. Cyrus led his army around it, a move that felt less like a victory and more like being allowed to walk deeper into a trap. The great king was not trying to stop them. He was choosing his ground. That the tension in the Greek camp became a palpable thing, a low hum of anxiety that replaced the dull ache of exhaustion. The men meticulously cleaned. Their equipment, the rasp of whetstones on iron spearheads and sword blades filled the air. They polished their shields and helmets, not for parade, but because a polished surface could deflect a blow, and a clean piece of bronze might be the only thing standing between them and eternity. The easy banter was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. Men wrote final letters home on scraps of papyrus, entrusting them to the few non-combatants they hoped might survive. They performed small, personal rituals, praying to the gods of their homelands, to Ares for courage, to Athena for strategy, to Hermes to guide their souls if the worst should come. Then, the news arrived. A deserter from the king's army, a Greek, slipped into their camp under the cover of darkness. He was brought before Cyrus and the commanders, and he confirmed their worst fears. Artaxerxes was close, and he was not coming alone. The numbers the deserter spoke of were so vast as to be almost incomprehensible. The king's army, he claimed, numbered over 1 million men. There were 12,000 cavalry, their horses armored in bronze. There were hundreds of scythed chariots, a terrifying weapon designed to mow down infantry like wheat. The sheer, crushing weight of the numbers settled over the Greek commanders like a shroud. Their own force, 10,000 hoplites and a few thousand peltasts, alongside Cyrus's far less reliable Asiatic troops, felt pitifully small. A tiny rock about to be overwhelmed by an avalanche. Cyrus, however, seemed unfazed. He projected an aura of supreme confidence, dismissing the numbers as a typical Oriental exaggeration designed to inspire terror. They may have many men, he announced to his commanders, his voice steady and dismissive. But men are not soldiers. You are soldiers. 1 Greek is worth 10 of them. That night, the final preparations were made. Cyrus held a council of war, laying out his plan of battle. The Greeks, under the command of Cunaxa, would hold the place of honor on the right flank, anchored against the Euphrates River. This was a crucial decision. It protected their flank from the massive Persian cavalry and allowed their own superior infantry to be the decisive hammer of the battle. Cyrus himself, with his personal guard of 600 elite Persian horsemen, would command the center, with the explicit goal of finding and killing his brother. He rode through the Greek camp one last time, a kingly figure in the flickering torchlight. He had put on his own armor, but he wore a simple headband instead of a helmet, making his face visible to all. It was a calculated act of bravado, a show of contempt for the enemy. He called out to the commanders by name, reminding them of their friendship, of the promises he had made. He spoke to the soldiers, his voice carrying in the still night air. He reminded them of the journey they had endured, of the wealth that awaited them just beyond the coming dawn. He spoke of Greek freedom versus Persian slavery, of courage versus numbers. "You are my friends, my allies," he declared. "Today, I have brought you to this fight. But tomorrow, it is you who will fight for me, for my kingdom, and for the fortunes I have promised you. Stand firm, and I will make every one of you a man envied in Greece." As the night wore on, a nervous energy gripped the camp. Sleep was impossible. The men lay on the ground in their armor, their spears by their sides, staring up at the unfamiliar Mesopotamian stars. They thought of their homes, of the wives and children they might never see again. They thought of the sheer, terrifying odds. They were a handful of men, thousands of miles from the sea, about to attack the ruler of the known world in his own backyard. This was the culmination of everything. The deceptions, the grueling march across the desert, the promises of gold, it had all led to this single, desperate moment. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. The dawn would bring either a crown for Cyrus and unimaginable riches for them, or a swift, brutal death on the plains of Cunaxa. The air was still and heavy. The eve of battle was over. The day of judgment had come. ****. Dawn broke on a scene of breathtaking, terrible majesty. The plain of Cunaxa, a flat, featureless expanse a few dozen miles north of Babylon, was filling with men. As the sun climbed, it glinted off a seemingly infinite sea of metal. The army of Artaxerxes was not a mere army. It was a nation in arms, a tidal wave of humanity that stretched from the bank of the Euphrates far into the eastern haze, so far that its other flank was lost to sight. The deserters' numbers may have been an exaggeration, but the reality was no less terrifying. There were hundreds of thousands of them. They were a dazzling, chaotic spectacle of the empire's might. There were Persians and Medes in their felt caps and scaled armor, Egyptians with their great wooden shields, cavalry from a dozen nations, their horses adorned with colorful plumes and bronze chamfrons, and at the forefront, spaced ominously along the line, were the scythe chariots. Their wheels were fitted with long, cruel blades, designed to slice through flesh and bone, to break the will of an infantry line before the main battle was even joined. The sheer noise was a weapon in itself. Low, rumbling murmur of thousands of voices, the neighing of horses, the creak of leather, a sound like an approaching earthquake. Facing this horde, the Greek force looked like a small, grim island of bronze in a vast and turbulent ocean. They were drawn up in a single, solid line, about a mile long. Their right flank rested securely on the riverbank, preventing them from being surrounded from that direction. Clearchus the Spartan was in command here, standing with his own Peloponnesian veterans. The other Greek contingents stretched out to his left, each under its own general. Xenophon, the Athenian observer, had armed himself as a hoplite and taken his place in the ranks with the men of his friend Proxenus. They stood in the silence of absolute discipline. There was no shouting, no wasted movement. Each man stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, his large day-round shield covering his own left side and the right side of the man next to him. The phalanx was not just a formation, it was a living organism, a single entity of 16,000 legs, 16,000 arms, and one unified purpose. Their spear points, a forest of sharpened iron, bristled over the top of the shield wall. They were a machine built for one specific task: to advance, to hold, and to kill. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun grew hotter. Sweat trickled down the faces of the Greeks, stinging their eyes. The psychological pressure was immense. They watched the Persian host slowly advance, a great, glittering wave of men coming to drown them. Then, the order came. Cyrus, having taken his position in the center with his cavalry, gave the signal. A horn blast cut through the air. The Greek commanders relayed the command, their voices sharp and clear. The paean, the ancient, chilling battle hymn to the god of war, began. It started as a low chant, a rhythmic, rising cry that grew in volume, until it was a deafening, terrifying roar that rolled across the plain. It was a sound that spoke of centuries of victory, a promise of disciplined violence that was utterly alien to the Persian host. Then, the second command, advance. The phalanx began to move. It was not a run, not a charge, but a steady, inexorable walk. The sound of 10,000 pairs of sandals tramping in perfect unison on the hard earth was a thunderous, rhythmic beat. They advanced in perfect order, their shields locked, their spears held level. The Persians, accustomed to the wild, screaming charges of tribal warfare, watched in a mixture of awe and horror. This was something else. This was not a mob. It was a monster. As they closed the distance, the Greek pace quickened. The walk became a trot, then a steady run. The paean rose in pitch, becoming a savage, triumphant scream. The discipline held. The line did not break. They were a single, solid wall of bronze and iron, hurtling towards the enemy. The Persian line opposite them, composed of Egyptian and Median infantry, began to waver. They had never seen anything like this. The sight of this relentless, screaming wall of death, combined with the terrifying reputation of Greek hoplites, shattered their nerve. Before the first spear was even thrown, before the first shield even made contact, they broke, they threw down their weapons, and they ran. It was a complete and total collapse. The entire left wing of the great king's army dissolved into a panicked, fleeing mob. The scythed chariots, which were meant to wreak havoc on the Greeks, were rendered useless. Some of their drivers were killed by the first volleys of arrows and slingstones. Others, seeing the infantry behind them flee, panicked, and turned, their own scythes cutting a bloody path through their own men. The Greeks, with a great shout of victory, broke their perfect formation and surged forward, slaughtering the fleeing, terrified Persians who were not fast enough to escape. It was not a battle, it was a rout. In a matter of minutes, the 10,000 hoplites had utterly smashed and scattered a force that outnumbered them by at least 10 to 1. They had faced the might of the Persian Empire and had broken it with contemptuous ease. They pursued the fleeing enemy for miles, their blood up, intoxicated by the sheer totality of their victory. They finally halted, their arms weary, their spears dripping with blood. They stood amidst the abandoned finery of the Persian camp, the rich tents and the panicked debris of a routed army. They looked back across the plain, expecting to see the rest of Cyrus's forces enjoying a similar victory. They looked for Cyrus himself, expecting to see him riding triumphant to greet them. The field was theirs. The enemy was broken. They had done their part. They had held up their end of the bargain with terrifying, brutal efficiency. They had won, and as they stood there, catching their breath in the dust and the heat, a dreadful, unnerving silence began to settle over the vast, empty battlefield. Their victory felt hollow, incomplete. Something was terribly wrong. While the Greeks were executing their flawless, terrifying advance on the right, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the center of the plain. This was not a contest of tactics or discipline. It was a battle of pure, primal emotion, a drama of fraternal hatred that had been simmering for years and was now reaching its violent, bloody climax. Here, the fate of the empire would be decided not by 10,000 men, but by two. Cyrus and his brother, Artaxerxes. Cyrus, at the head of his 600 elite Persian cavalrymen, had a single, all-consuming objective. He was not interested in defeating the enemy army in a conventional sense. He cared little for the disposition of his own left flank, which was already beginning to crumble under the weight of the king's numbers. His eyes, and the entire focus of his being, were fixed on one point in the distance, the royal standard of Artaxerxes. The king was positioned in the center of his own massive army, surrounded by a personal guard of thousands of the best horsemen in the empire. It was the traditional place for a Persian monarch in battle, a command post from which to direct the vast host. For Cyrus, it was not a command post, it was a target. He knew that this war would not be won by routing flanks or capturing territory. It would be won by killing one man. If Artaxerxes fell, the army would lose its head, its will to fight. The empire would be his dot. As the Greek phalanx began its inexorable roll-up of the Persian left, a cloud of dust and confusion enveloped the center of the field. Through this swirling chaos, Cyrus strained to keep sight of his brother's standard. He held his own cavalry in check, a coiled spring of potential energy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was a hunter, and he was waiting for his prey to reveal itself. Then, he saw him. Through a gap in the dust, he caught a glimpse of Artaxerxes himself, unmistakable on his charger, surrounded by his cohort of bodyguards. The distance was not great. For a moment, the two brothers might have locked eyes across the battlefield, the two focal points of a dynastic civil war. In that instant, all strategy, all caution, all thought of personal safety evaporated from Cyrus's mind. He was no longer a general or a would-be king. He was a man consumed by a lifetime of perceived slights, by the humiliation of his near execution, by the burning conviction that the man on the throne before him was a usurper. A great cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, tore from his throat. "I see the man," he screamed. He did not give an order. He did not signal a charge. He simply acted, Spurring his horse into a gallop, he broke away from his own guards, charging alone. A single missile of vengeance aimed directly at his brother's heart. His personal guard, the 600 horsemen sworn to protect him, were caught by surprise. They spurred their own mounts, desperately trying to keep up with their reckless, incandescent prince. It was a charge of breathtaking madness. Cyrus, with his small retinue, plunged directly into the dense mass of the thousands of royal bodyguards surrounding the king. It should have been suicide. He should have been overwhelmed and cut down in seconds. But such was the force of his fury, the sheer shock of his personal appearance, that he began to carve a bloody path through them. His spear found its mark again and again. He fought with the strength of a man possessed, his every blow fueled by years of resentment. The royal guard, stunned by this direct assault on the king's person, momentarily buckled. Cyrus and his men smashed into them, and for a few desperate moments it seemed the impossible might happen. They were closing the distance. Cyrus was almost upon his brother. He hurled his javelin. The weapon flew true, striking Artaxerxes in the chest, piercing his cuirass and wounding him. The king swayed in his saddle, blood staining his royal robes. A cry of alarm went up from his guards. This was the moment. This was the culmination of Cyrus's life's ambition. Victory was a spear thrust away. But in his frenzied, obsessive charge, he had become isolated, pulling ahead of his own men. He was a single rider in a sea of enemies. As he raised his weapon for the final blow, a javelin, thrown by a minor nobleman or a common soldier, struck him from the side. It hit him just under the eye, a vicious, brutal blow that penetrated his skull. He faltered, his vision blurring, the world turning to a red haze. He slumped forward and fell from his horse, crashing to the dusty ground. He was not dead yet, but he was down, helpless, at the very feet of his brother's guards. The king's men, enraged by the wounding of their monarch and seeing their tormentor brought low, swarmed over him. He was stabbed, cut, and bludgeoned. Within moments, the lifeblood of the rebellion, the charismatic prince who had brought an army 1,000 miles on the force of his will, was extinguished in a frenzy of loyalist rage. His personal guard, seeing him fall, fought with the desperation of men who knew all was lost. They made a stand over his body, and they were annihilated, dying to the last man around the corpse of their prince. The Persian tragedy was complete. On one side of the field, the Greeks had achieved a victory, so total it was almost absurd. On the other, the man for whom they were fighting lay dead in the dust, his ambition choked out of him by a random, anonymous spear. The head of the rebellion had been severed. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. But for the 10,000 Greeks standing victorious on their flank, the greatest ordeal of their lives was just about to begin. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the blood-soaked plain. The Greeks stood in a state of weary, triumphant confusion. The adrenaline of the charge and the slaughter had begun to fade, replaced by the dull ache of exertion and the metallic smell of death that hung heavy in the air. They had done their job with a terrifying efficiency that had surprised even themselves. They had met the great king's army, and had not just defeated it, but had swept it from the field as if it were chaff in the wind. They reformed their ranks, a habitual act of discipline, and took stock. Their casualties were astonishingly light. Some men were wounded, bruised, and exhausted, but scarcely a single hoplite had been killed. It was a victory of almost mythical proportions. They looked out from their position on the right flank, across the vast empty space where the enemy's left wing had once stood. They saw the debris of a routed army, abandoned weapons, overturned chariots, the bodies of the slain. Their mood was one of self-congratulation and eager anticipation. They had fulfilled their contract, and now it was time for their reward. They expected to see Cyrus riding towards them, his face alight with triumph, ready to shower them with the praise and, more importantly, the gold he had promised. They scanned the battlefield, looking for his standard, for his elite cavalry, for any sign of the rest of their army, but they saw nothing. The center of the plain, where Cyrus was supposed to have been fighting, was a swirl of dust and confusion. The left flank, where Cyrus's Asiatic troops had been positioned, was eerily empty. There was no sign of a friendly force. The great roar of battle had subsided into a profound and unsettling quiet, broken only by the groans of the wounded, and the cries of scavenging birds that were already beginning to circle overhead. A deep sense of unease, a cold premonition, began to creep through the ranks, chilling the warmth of their recent victory. Where was Cyrus? Had he pursued the fleeing enemy all the way to Babylon? It seemed unlikely, reckless. Where was the rest of the army? Clearchus, ever the pragmatist, decided they could not simply wait in ignorance. He gave the order to advance, to march back, towards their camp, which lay some miles behind their starting position. Perhaps there they would find news. The phalanx, once again a single, disciplined unit, began the slow, weary march back over the ground they had so recently conquered. As they marched, the evidence of what had happened in the center of the field became sickeningly clear. The bodies here were different. They were not just the lightly armed Persian infantry they had routed. These were elite soldiers, men of Cyrus's personal guard, lying dead in heaps around a single, terrible spot. The ground was churned and soaked with blood. It was the unmistakable sight of a desperate, last-ditch struggle. The feeling of unease blossomed into full-blown dread. The soldiers marched in silence, their earlier elation completely gone, replaced by a grim, unspoken fear. They reached their camp to find it had been partially plundered. The king's forces, while routed on the Greek front, had evidently swung around and looted the baggage train, taking supplies, personal belongings, and even some of the camp followers. But the material losses were insignificant compared to the news that awaited them. A few survivors from Cyrus's Asiatic contingents staggered into the Greek lines, their faces masks of terror and defeat. They told a fragmented, horrifying story of what had happened on the other side of the battlefield. They spoke of a general collapse, of Cyrus's mad, suicidal charge, of a desperate fight around the king's person. Then, a horseman arrived, galloping frantically towards them. He was a high-ranking Persian, one of Cyrus's most trusted lieutenants. His face was streaked with dust and tears. He reined in his horse before Clearchus and the assembled generals, his chest heaving. He did not need to speak. The utter despair in his eyes told the entire story. But he gave them the words anyway, and the words fell like stones into the dead silence of the Greek command circle. Cyrus is dead. The news spread through the army like a plague. A low groan of disbelief and horror rippled through the ranks. It could not be true. They had won. They had been invincible. How could their leader, the man whose ambition was the entire reason for their existence, be dead? The reality crashed down upon them with the force of a physical blow. Their victory was not just meaningless, it was a catastrophe. They had not won a war, they had merely won a single, isolated battle in a war that was now irrevocably lost. Their employer was a corpse lying somewhere on the plain. The man who had promised them riches beyond their wildest dreams was gone. His promises turned to dust. The full, terrifying weight of their situation descended upon them. They were not the victorious vanguard of a new king. They were a tiny, isolated pocket of rebels, stranded more than 1,000 miles from home, in the dead center of an infinitely hostile empire. The man they had come to kill was still on his throne. His army, though bloodied, was still immense, and his personal anger towards them would now be boundless. They had tried to steal his kingdom, and had succeeded only in making themselves the most wanted men in the world. As darkness fell over the plain of Cunaxa, it was a darkness of the soul. The elation of their triumph had evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter ashes of despair. They had proven they were the greatest soldiers in the world, but their skill had only served to strand them on the shores of hell. They were alone, leaderless, and surrounded. Their victory had been their undoing. The night that followed the battle was a long, dark vigil of the soul. The Greeks huddled in their camp, but there was no rest, no sleep. The silence that had fallen was more terrifying than the roar of combat. It was a silence filled with the vast, empty space of the empire that now surrounded them. A hostile void stretching for thousands of miles in every direction. The flickering campfires cast dancing, monstrous shadows, and every man was an island of his own private fear. Their victory, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a cruel joke. They had performed a military miracle, only to have it rendered utterly meaningless by a single, reckless charge. They were like surgeons who had executed a flawless operation, only to find the patient had died on the table from an unrelated, self-inflicted wound. The sheer, bitter irony of it was a poison that seeped into their morale. In the morning light, the full scope of their predicament was laid bare. They were an army without a cause, a weapon without a wielder. Their purpose, which had been so clear and compelling just 24 hours earlier to place Cyrus on the throne, had vanished into thin air. They were no longer fighting for anything. Now, They had to begin fighting for themselves. Their very identity had been stripped from them. They were not conquerors, they were not liberators. They were simply survivors. Their new, undeclared mission had none of the allure of glory or gold. The only objective now was to get home, a goal so remote and seemingly impossible that to even speak of it felt like an act of madness. Greece. The word itself sounded like a myth, a half-forgotten dream. It lay on the other side of a world that wanted them dead. Between them and the shores of the Aegean Sea were thousands of miles of hostile territory, dozens of warlike tribes, impassable rivers, scorching deserts, and freezing mountains, and everywhere there was the shadow of the great king, Artaxerxes. The man they had come to depose was now the absolute arbiter of their fate. His brother was dead, the rebellion crushed. His authority was now unquestioned, and they, the Greek mercenaries, were the last loose thread of the failed insurrection. They were a living insult to his power, a foreign army that had marched to his doorstep, shattered his best troops, and aided his hated brother. His anger, they knew, would be deep, personal, and implacable. He would not, could not, let them simply walk away. To do so would be a sign of weakness, an invitation for future adventurers to try the same gamble. They had to be made an example of. They had to be destroyed. The Greek commanders, led by the stoic Clearchus, gathered in a tense council. The options they faced were all shades of impossible. Could they find another Persian noble to support, another pretender to the throne? Unlikely. The rebellion had been entirely centered on the person of Cyrus. With him gone, his cause was dead. Could they fortify their position and try to carve out their own small kingdom here in the heart of Mesopotamia? It was a fantasy. They had limited supplies and no way to replenish them. They would be besieged and starved into submission within weeks. The only viable option, however slim, was to march. But where? To march back the way they came, through the deserts they had barely survived, seemed like suicide. Their best hope, the commanders reasoned, was to march north. The route was unknown, but they knew that far to the north lay the shores of the Euxine Sea, the Black Sea, and on the shores of that sea were Greek colonies, cities like Sinope and Trapeze. If they could reach the sea, they could find ships. If they could find ships, they could get home. It was a desperate plan, a thin thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. The journey north would be even longer and more arduous than the one that had brought them here. It would take them through the wild, uncharted mountains of Kurdistan and Armenia, lands inhabited by fierce, independent tribes who bowed to no king. But it was the only plan they had. The army itself was a fragile entity. Their unity had been forged by Cyrus's leadership and his gold. Now, both were gone. They were a collection of disparate parts, Arcadians, Athenians, Spartans, Thessalians, held together only by that shared danger. The old rivalries and suspicions could easily resurface, tearing them apart from within. Clearchus and the other generals knew that maintaining discipline and morale would be a battle in itself, as critical as any fight against the Persians. They were an army adrift on a hostile sea, their anchor cut, their sails torn. Every direction held its own terror. They were surrounded by the silent, waiting forces of the victorious king. They were a nation unto themselves, a mobile city-state of 10,000 men, with no allies, no supplies, and no future beyond what they could carve out for themselves with the points of their spears. The world had shrunk to the perimeter of their camp, and beyond it lay only death. Their war for Cyrus was over. Their war for survival had just begun. For several days, the two armies watched each other across the blood-stained plain. The Greeks, formed in a tight defensive square, did not move from their camp. The vast host of Artaxerxes, licking its wounds and regrouping, did not advance. It was a tense, unnerving stalemate. The air crackled with uncertainty. The Greeks, though masters of the battlefield, were paralyzed by their strategic predicament. The king, though victorious in the war, was wary of the strange, invincible infantry that had so effortlessly annihilated his left wing. He had won the throne, but he was in no hurry to test his army again against the terrifying efficiency of the Greek phalanx. The Greeks were running out of food. The camp they had looted from the enemy after their victory provided a temporary reprieve, but it would not last. The surrounding countryside, loyal to the king, was a closed door. They could not forage, they could not trade. Every day they waited, they grew weaker. Clearchus knew that this paralysis was a death sentence. They had to move. to force the issue. He gave the order to pack up what remained of their baggage and prepare to march north. It was a bluff, a show of defiance intended to provoke a response, and it worked. As the Greeks began to form their column, a party of horsemen was seen approaching from the Persian camp. They rode slowly, carrying no visible weapons, their hands held open to show peaceful intent. At their head were several high-ranking Persian nobles, including a man who had been a close confidant of the late Cyrus. But with them was a Greek. His name was Philinus, an expatriate who had found favor and fortune in the king's service. He was the king's messenger. The heralds were brought before the assembled Greek commanders. The mood was tense, thick with suspicion. Clearchus, acting as the chief spokesman for the Greeks, stood impassive, his face a hard mask. Philinus, speaking in the familiar Greek tongue that was both a comfort and a warning, delivered the king's message. It was simple, direct, and utterly arrogant. "The king," he began, his voice echoing in the silence, "having won the victory and killed Cyrus, now considers you to be his property. You are in his land, surrounded by his forces, with no hope of escape. He commands you to come to his camp, lay down your arms, and throw yourselves upon his mercy." A wave of angry murmurs rippled through the Greek officers. Lay down their arms. It was unthinkable. For a hoplite, his shield and spear were not just tools, they were a part of his identity, the source of his strength and his only guarantee of safety. To surrender them was to become a helpless slave, utterly dependent on the whims of a man they had just tried to kill. It was a demand for unconditional surrender. Clearchus's reply was cold and sharp. He played for time, engaging in a verbal sparring match with Philinus. "You are a Greek, Philinus," Clearchus said, his voice laced with contempt. "You see the position we are in. What would you advise us to do?" It was a clever trap, forcing the messenger to either give advice against his master's interest or admit that he was counseling his own countrymen to accept slavery or death. Philinus, the practiced courtier, evaded the question, repeating the king's demand. The other Greek generals chimed in, their voices filled with a proud defiance. "We have only two things of value," one declared, "our arms and our virtue. If we keep our arms, we believe we can keep our virtue. If we surrender them, we will lose both." Xenophon, the Athenian observer, spoke up with a fiery passion, arguing that to surrender their weapons was to surrender their lives. Finally, Clearchus, having gauged the unwavering resolve of his men, gave the official Greek response. His words were pure Spartan laconicism, dripping with disdain. "Tell your king," he said, his eyes locking with Philinus's, "that if he wants our arms, he should come and try to take them." It was a declaration of breathtaking audacity, a direct challenge to the ruler of the world. Philinus and the Persian nobles departed, their faces grim. The Greeks had called the king's bluff. A day later, a new delegation arrived. This time, the tone was completely different. The heralds were led by Tissaphernes, the powerful satrap of Lydia, and a man who had been Cyrus's bitter rival. He was now one of the king's most trusted advisors. His loyalty proven by the recent conflict, Tissaphernes did not come with demands. He came with an offer of friendship. He approached the Greek camp with a great show of respect and admiration. He spoke of the Greeks' incredible bravery at Cunaxa, a feat of arms that had earned them the respect of the king himself. He claimed that he, as a neighbor to the Greek cities in Ionia, felt a special kinship with them and had been pleading their case before Artaxerxes. He presented them with a stunning proposal. The king, he said, in his magnanimity, was prepared to forgive them. He understood they had been deceived by Cyrus and were merely fulfilling a contract. Tissaphernes himself, he promised, would personally escort them home. He would lead them north, provide them with markets to buy food, and ensure their safe passage through the king's lands until they reached the sea. He would be their guide, their protector, their savior. All he asked for in return was a truce. The Greeks were to swear an oath not to harm the lands or people of the king, and the king, in turn, would swear an oath to protect them. The offer seemed too good to be true. It was everything they could have hoped for, a guaranteed food supply, a safe passage, a royal escort. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning army. The Greek soldiers, weary of the uncertainty in facing the prospect of starvation, were overwhelmingly in favor of accepting. The promise of home was a potent lure, but in the minds of Clearchus and the more cynical veterans, a seed of doubt was planted. Why this sudden generosity? Why would the king, who had just demanded their unconditional surrender, now offer them a friendly escort. It was a dramatic, inexplicable reversal. The Persian court was not known for its forgiveness or magnanimity. It was known for its treachery, its long memory, and its brutal, patient revenge. Despite these misgivings, they had no other viable option. To refuse the offer would be to declare their distrust and force a confrontation they could not be certain of winning. To accept it, even if it was a trap, at least allowed them to start marching, to get food, to move closer to home. They agreed. Oaths were sworn over the blood of sacrificed animals, a solemn ritual binding both sides to the truce. Tissaphernes would be their guide. The king had offered them a path out of hell. But as the Greeks began to march alongside the Persian host, a gnawing fear remained. They were placing their lives in the hands of their mortal enemy, trusting the word of a man whose entire career had been built on deceit and intrigue. They were following him into the unknown, hoping his offer was one of mercy, and fearing it was a lie of monstrous proportions. The march north began under a cloud of profound and unsettling cognitive dissonance. Two armies that had been mortal enemies just days before now marched in parallel, a bizarre and tense procession. The Greeks kept to their tight, disciplined formations, a mobile fortress of bronze and iron, a short distance away. The vast, colorful, and chaotic host of Tis shadowed them. The truce held, but the atmosphere was thick with a suspicion that no oath could dispel. Tissaphernes, true to his word, arranged for markets to be set up at the end of each day's march. The Greeks, with what remained of Cyrus's money, could purchase grain, dates, and wine from local villagers under the satrap's protection. For the common soldier, this was proof that the truce was real. Their bellies were full for the first time since the battle, and the simple act of buying food, instead of fighting for it, was a powerful balm to their frayed nerves. The promise of home seemed more tangible with every northward step. Yet, for the commanders, the signs of treachery were everywhere. The Persians marched too close for comfort. Their cavalry would often ride near the Greek column, their faces unreadable, their intentions ambiguous. Skirmishes broke out at the edges of the camps. A Greek wood-gathering party might be harassed. A Persian straggler might be found dead. Each incident was a spark that threatened to ignite the powder keg of their mutual hatred. Distrust festered within the Greek camp itself. The men began to grumble, their fear manifesting as anger towards their own leaders. They accused Clearchus of being too friendly with Tissaphernes, of holding secret meetings, of perhaps plotting to sell them out to the Persians for his own personal gain. The Spartan general, with his aloof and authoritarian demeanor, did little to quell these rumors. He believed in command, not consensus, and he saw the satrap as his direct counterpart, the only man worth dealing with. The march was slow, agonizingly so. Tissaphernes seemed to be in no hurry, his army setting a crawling pace. The Greeks grew more and more impatient, feeling that they were being deliberately delayed, led in circles. Their morale being slowly eroded by the psychological strain of the long, tense journey. They crossed the Tigris River, moving even deeper into the heart of the empire, and with every step, their sense of isolation grew. Clearchus, seeing the discipline of his army beginning to fray under the strain of suspicion, decided he had to force a confrontation, not with weapons, but with words. He believed that tension was born of misunderstanding, a failure of communication between the two armies. He requested a personal meeting with Tissaphernes, a summit to clear the air and reaffirm their pact of friendship. Tissaphernes readily agreed. He suggested a meeting of the senior leadership from both sides. It would be a gesture of ultimate trust, a council of commanders to resolve all disputes and smooth the path forward. He proposed that Clearchus bring his foremost senior generals, along with 20 company-grade captains, to his personal tent. They would talk, share a meal, and put an end to the silly rumors that were poisoning their relationship. The proposal was met with deep misgivings by many of the Greek officers. It felt too convenient, too staged. To send their entire senior command, the brain of their army, into the heart of the Persian camp seemed like an act of incredible folly. It violated every instinct of a soldier. Menan, the Thessalian, ever the opportunist, argued strongly in favor of it, eager to curry more favor with the powerful Others urged caution, reminding Clearchus of the long and storied history of Persian treachery. But Clearchus, in a rare and fatal miscalculation, overruled them. He was a Spartan, a man of a culture that, for all its harshness, valued a direct, if brutal, form of honesty. He could not, or would not, believe that a man of Tissaphernes's stature would engage in such a dishonorable, cowardly act of betrayal after swearing a sacred oath. He was tired of the whispers and the suspicion. He believed a frank conversation, man to man, could solve the problem. His pride and his frustration blinded him to the obvious danger. He made his decision. He would go. He chose the 4 other senior generals to accompany him: Proxenus the Boeotian, Menon the Thessalian, Aegeus the Arcadian, and Socrates the Achaean. 20 other captains were selected to join them as a subordinate delegation. They would represent the Greek army, unarmed and in good faith, to solidify the truce. On the appointed day, the delegation prepared to leave the Greek camp. There was a sense of foreboding among the soldiers who stayed behind. They watched their leaders ride out, a small, vulnerable party heading towards the sprawling, alien city of the Persian camp. Xenophon, who, as a junior officer, was not part of the high command, felt a deep sense of dread. It all felt wrong. The generals and captains reached the Persian camp and were greeted with elaborate courtesy. They were dismounted and led through the maze of tents towards the opulent pavilion of Tissaphernes, which stood in the center of the encampment. The satrap himself came out to greet them, his face a mask of friendship and welcome. He embraced Clearchus smiling and invited them inside. The 5 generals, the entire strategic leadership of the 10,000, walked into the satrap's tent. The 20 captains were told to wait outside. The tent flap closed behind the generals. The Feast of Lies was about to begin. **** inside the tent. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and roasted meat. Rich carpets covered the ground, and low tables were laden with silver platters of food and wine. Tissaphernes was the perfect host, his voice smooth as silk, his gestures expansive and welcoming. He motioned for Clearchus and the other 4 generals to recline on the plush cushions, to relax, to speak as friends. The conversation began, flowing easily at first, a masterclass in Persian diplomacy and dissimulation. Tissaphernes listened patiently to Clearchus's complaints about the skirmishes and the slow pace of the march, nodding sympathetically, promising to investigate, assuring him that these were minor issues that could be easily resolved. Outside, the 20 Greek captains waited. They stood in a loose group, making small talk, their initial nervousness perhaps eased by the sounds of polite conversation emanating from the tent. They were surrounded by the casual bustle of the Persian camp. Soldiers moved about their duties, merchants hawked their wares, and high-ranking Persian nobles, clad in vibrant silks, observed the waiting Greeks with a detached, unreadable curiosity. The scene was one of perfect, calculated normalcy. The minutes ticked by. The sun beat down. The captains grew restless. They had expected a brief meeting, a formal reaffirmation of the truce, and then a swift return to their own camp. This leisurely pace felt strange, out of place. Then, the signal was given. It was not a shout or a trumpet blast. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was a single, sharp handclap from within the tent, or a colored flag raised discreetly on a nearby pole. Whatever it was, the effect was instantaneous and horrific. From inside the tent, the sounds of polite conversation were abruptly cut off, replaced by a strangled cry, the crash of a heavy object, and the muffled, desperate sounds of a violent struggle. The 5 generals, unarmed and caught completely by surprise in the midst of their diplomatic meal, were being overwhelmed. They had no chance. They were seized by guards who had been hidden within the tent's opulent draperies, bound and gagged before they could even draw a breath to shout a warning. Simultaneously, outside the tent, the carefully constructed illusion of normalcy shattered. The Persian soldiers who had been casually milling about suddenly converged on the 20 waiting captains. The nobles who had been watching with detached curiosity now drew swords from beneath their robes. The trap laid with such patient, meticulous care was sprung. The captains, realizing what was happening a second too late, reached for the short swords at their belts, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded. It was not a fight. It was a massacre. The Persians fell upon them with a savage, premeditated fury. The air was filled with the screams of the dying, the wet, percussive sound of blades striking flesh and bone. Some of the captains died where they stood, cut down in a flurry of blows. Others were captured, disarmed, and bound, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. From the Greek camp a mile away, the soldiers watched. They had been observing the Persian camp with anxious eyes ever since their leaders had departed. They saw the small group of their captains waiting outside the great tent. And then they saw the sudden, violent swirl of activity. They could not make out the details, but they could see the unmistakable chaos of an attack. Then, a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. They saw Persian cavalrymen galloping through the camp, their swords raised, cutting down any of the Greek captains who had managed to break free and run. They saw their leaders being dragged, bound and struggling, from Tissaphernes's tent. Clearchus, the proud Spartan, Proxenus, the idealistic Boeotian, Menon, the greedy Thessalian, all of them. Their entire high command were now prisoners, their authority stripped away, their lives forfeit. A great collective cry of horror and rage rose from the Greek army. It was a sound of pure animal anguish. The betrayal was so complete, so audacious, so profoundly dishonorable by their own cultural standards, that it defied comprehension. The oaths sworn on the blood of sacrificed animals, the promises of friendship, the feast, it had all been a lie, a monstrous, elaborate deception designed for this single, devastating moment. The soldiers watched in helpless fury as the Persian cavalry began to form up, their dark silhouettes stark against the afternoon sun. They saw horsemen riding back and forth between the two camps, their gestures mocking, their voices carrying taunts across the plain. They were flaunting their treachery, rubbing the Greeks' faces in their own gullibility and powerlessness. The full weight of the catastrophe settled upon the army. They had not just lost their leaders, they had lost the very concept of trust. The bridge of diplomacy, which Clearchus had so fatally tried to build, had been done. There was no one left to negotiate with, nothing left to negotiate for. The king's treacherous offer had been revealed for what it was, a baited hook, and they had swallowed it whole. Now, they were caught, leaderless, and waiting for the slaughter to begin. As dusk settled over the plain, it brought with it a darkness that was more than the absence of light. It was a crushing, suffocating despair that fell upon the Greek camp like a physical weight. The bodies of their murdered captains lay on the plain between the two armies. Their generals were gone captured, and certainly destined for a horrific, drawn-out death at the king's whim. The brain of the army had been surgically removed. The soldiers huddled around their low-burning fires, but the flames offered no warmth, no comfort. They were an army of ghosts, 10,000 men lost in a silent, collective state of shock. The brazenness of the betrayal had shattered them. It was a blow not just to their command structure, but to their very worldview. The sacred oaths, the gestures of peace, the shared meal, all had been a lie. They were adrift in a world where the fundamental rules of honor, as they understood them, did not apply. Panic was a cold serpent coiling in the gut of every man. They were surrounded. The massive Persian army, which had feigned friendship just hours before, was now an encircling ring of imminent death. The Greeks could hear the sounds from the enemy camp, the confident shouts, the jeers, the laughter. The Persians were celebrating their cleverness, their victory. They were waiting for the dawn, when they could ride in and slaughter the leaderless, demoralized rabble that remained. For the Greeks, there was no one to give orders, no one to form a plan, no one to offer a word of encouragement. The remaining junior officers were just as stunned and terrified as the common soldiers. The structure that had held them together, the authority of the generals, was gone, and in its place was a vacuum of terror. Men did not eat. They did not speak. They simply sat, staring into the darkness, each man wrestling with the certainty of his own impending death. They thought of the homes they would never see, the families they would never embrace. They thought of the foolishness of their own hope, the naivety with which they had walked into the trap. This was the end. They had marched 1,000 miles, to die here, in this nameless patch of dirt in the heart of Mesopotamia, not in a blaze of glory, but as the victims of a cowardly trick. Despair was a physical contagion. It spread from man to man, a silent plague of hopelessness. Some men wept openly, others sat in stony, catatonic silence. The discipline that had been their greatest strength, the very thing that made them hoplites, dissolved. They were no longer a phalanx, no longer an army. They were just a collection of terrified, isolated men waiting for the morning light and the slaughter it would bring. This was the absolute nadir, the moment of total psychological collapse. This was the darkest night of their lives. Asterisk, asterisk, in the midst of this ocean of despair, one man could not find the solace of apathy. His name was Xenophon. He was not a general, not a professional soldier. not a man hardened by a lifetime of command. He was the Athenian gentleman adventurer, the student of Socrates, the observer who had come along for the thrill of the journey. He lay on the ground like the others, trying to sleep, but his mind raced. He felt the cold dread, the certainty of doom. But as he lay there, a different feeling began to stir within him. Anger. He thought of his home, of Athens. He saw visions of it burning, of his family enslaved. He realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that to lie here and wait for death was a choice. It was a form of surrender as complete as laying down their arms. To do nothing was to accept the enemy's victory. Socrates, his teacher, had taught him that virtue was knowledge, and that a man's greatest duty was to think, to reason, to act upon his convictions, even in the face of death. An idea, born of desperation and philosophical fire, took root. What if they fought back? What if they chose not to be victims? Getting to his feet, Xenophon began to walk through the desolate camp. He was a man possessed by a new, fragile purpose. He sought out the remaining captains of his friend Proxenus' contingent, men he knew, men who were huddled in the same misery as everyone else. He found them, their faces pale in the firelight. "Why are we sitting here?" Xenophon's voice was low, but it cut through the silence. "Are we waiting for the king to come and kill us? Do we think he will spare us after we tried to take his throne? If we do nothing, we will die a coward's death. But if we fight, if we make them earn it, we might at least die with honor. And who knows, the gods often favor the bold. Our only hope, our only chance, is to rely on ourselves." His words were like sparks landing on dry tinder. He was not offering a solution, but something far more important, a choice. He was reminding them that they were not yet dead. He went from fire to fire, gathering the remaining officers from other contingents, repeating his message. He woke them from their stupor, not with false hope, but with a call to action, a reminder of who they were. They were Greeks, they were soldiers. Their arms and their virtue were all they had left. As dawn approached, a crowd of officers had gathered. Around Xenophon, the despair had not vanished, but it was now mingled with a new, defiant energy. Xenophon, standing before them, gave the speech of his life. He was no longer a mere observer. He was a leader, forged in the crucible of that one dark night. He laid out the stark reality of their situation, but he framed it not as a death sentence, but as a challenge. He reminded them of their victory at Cunaxa, of their innate superiority as soldiers. He argued that their greatest weapon was not their spears, but their discipline and their intelligence. They had lost their generals, yes, but they had not lost their ability to lead themselves. "We must elect new leaders," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "We must show the enemy and ourselves that this army is not dependent on a few men. It is an army of 10,000 leaders." The idea was revolutionary. In a single stroke, the hierarchy was rebuilt from the bottom up. The soldiers, who just hours before had been a leaderless mob, were now empowered. An impromptu election was held. The men chose the bravest and most respected among their remaining officers. A grizzled Spartan named Cyrus was elected to the senior command, a nod to Spartan military prestige, and to the surprise of many, Xenophon the Athenian, intellectual, the amateur soldier, was chosen as one of the new generals. He had given them a voice when they were silent, and now they gave him their trust. The army had a new brain, forged in the field, born of desperation. The mood began to shift. The act of choosing, of taking control of their own fate, was transformative. The sun rose not on a camp of victims, but on an army that had, against all odds, been reborn. The first act of the new command was a brutal but necessary piece of psychological warfare, directed at themselves. They could not afford to be slow. They could not afford to be sentimental. "Burn the tents," Xenophon commanded. "Burn the wagons. Burn everything we cannot carry on our backs. We are not settlers. We are a fighting column. Our only home is our formation. Our only possessions are our weapons." A great pyre was made in the center of the camp. The soldiers watched as their last comforts, their tents and excess baggage, went up in flames. It was a painful, symbolic act. They were severing their last ties to a normal existence. From now on, they would sleep on the ground, exposed to the elements, but the fire was also a purification. It hardened them, focused them. They were now lean, stripped down to the essentials: men, weapons, and a single desperate purpose. They formed a new kind of phalanx, a massive hollow square. The remaining baggage animals and the few non-combatants were placed in the protected center. The four sides of the square were walls of shields and spears, commanded by the newly elected generals. Cyrus the Spartan took the vanguard, leading the march. The oldest and most experienced generals commanded the flanks, and Xenophon, with a hand-picked rearguard, took the most dangerous position of all, the tail, the place where the enemy would strike first and most often, with their camp burning behind them. A defiant plume of smoke rising into the Mesopotamian sky, they began to march. They did not march as a defeated army slinking away. They marched as a single, bristling fortress of men, a creature of bronze and iron, moving with grim purpose across the hostile land. They were marching north, towards the distant, mythical sea. The 2,000-mile march from hell had truly begun. Months later, after enduring relentless attacks, starvation, and a winter of unimaginable brutality in the frozen mountains of Armenia, the army was on the verge of collapse. They had fought their way through hostile tribes, navigated treacherous terrain, and survived a deep, killing cold that had claimed hundreds of their comrades. They were gaunt, frostbitten, and clothed in rags, their spirits worn down to a thin, fragile thread, but they had kept marching north. The vanguard of the army, led by Cyrus, was struggling up the slope of yet another mountain. It was named Mount Thechis. The men in the rear, including Xenophon, heard a commotion from the front of the column. The shouting grew louder, spreading down the line. It was not a cry of alarm or a battle cry. It was something else, something they had not heard in a very long time, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The men at the front were screaming, waving their arms, embracing each other, many of them weeping openly. The soldiers behind them, not knowing the cause, assumed it was another enemy attack and began to prepare for battle. But the shouting continued, and a single, repeated word began to be discernible, passed from man to man down the long, weary column. Thalata. Xenophon and the men of the rearguard, thinking it must be something of great importance, spurred their horses and hurried to the front. As they crested the summit of the mountain, they understood. There, stretching out before them, shimmering under the distant sun, was a vast, impossible expanse of blue. It was the sea, the Euxine Sea, the Black Sea. The sight broke them. These hard, brutal men, who had faced down an empire and survived the wrath of nature, were overcome. They fell to their knees. They laughed and cried at the same time. They embraced strangers as brothers. Xenophon saw men, their faces scarred by frostbite and battle, tears streaming through the grime, pointing and shouting the word over and over again, as if it were a prayer. Philata, the sea. It was more than just a body of water. It was the end of their exile. It was the edge of the Greek world. It was a promise that home was no longer a fever dream, but a real, attainable place. They had done it. They had walked out of the heart of the Persian Empire. They had crossed deserts and frozen mountains. They had defeated every enemy, man and nature alike. They had survived. They built a great cairn of stones on the mountaintop, a monument to their ordeal and their deliverance. They left behind their battered shields and armor as offerings to the gods. They had reached the sea. They had come home. The journey was not quite over. They still had to contend with treacherous Greek colonial politics, further betrayals, and the difficulty of finding passage for so many men. But the great ordeal, the march from hell, was finished. Of the more than 10,000 who had marched into the heart of Persia, nearly 6,000 had survived to see the sea. They were no longer the same men who had been lured by some gold. They were harder, wiser, and bound by a brotherhood forged in unimaginable suffering. They were legends in their own time. They returned to the Greek world not as failures, but as heroes of an epic tale. They were the unbroken. They had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. They had done more than just survive. They had triumphed. The story of their journey, the Anabasis, would be told and retold. It proved that a small, disciplined force of free men could march anywhere, endure anything, and defeat armies many times their size. It exposed the weakness at the heart of the mighty Persian Empire, and a generation later, a young Macedonian king, a student of history and a genius of war, would read this story. He would see the path they had blazed. He would understand what it meant, and he would finish what the 10,000 had started. His name was Alexander the Great, and the epic march of Xenophon and his comrades would serve as the blueprint for his conquest of the world. The retreat from hell had, in the end, paved the way for an empire